The story I am about to relay happened to me and a group of friends about 10 years ago, and is all true. I don't consider my writing or storytelling skills to be the best, so please bear with me. As a teenager in high school around the year 2000, me and some friends decided to start doing ghost hunts. This was before any of the television shows about ghost hunting permeated the television airwaves. I think we got the idea from seeing other such groups on the internet. We began by doing investigations, mostly in graveyards. We would have a digital camera, an EMF reader, and a Ouija board. Folks online would warn us about using an Ouija board, but we maintained that it was the only reliable way we had during hunts to directly communicate with spirits. The use of a Ouija board would eventually come back to haunt us. After conducting investigations in most of the local graveyards, we noticed an old abandoned farmhouse just down the road from a cemetery we frequented. One night, 3 friends and I decided to go into this 2-story house armed with a flashlight, candles, and of course our Ouija board. This wasn't just any Ouija board, it was an original William Fold, one I had won in an eBay auction that had been manufactured in Salem, Massachusetts around the early 1960s. So my buddies and I, equipment ready, all piled into our vehicle and made our way to the location of the house. It must have been around 1 o'clock in the morning when we arrived. Upon exiting the vehicle and making our way to the house, I distinctly remember a frog appearing out of nowhere and leaping across our path. For some reason, this common occurrence gave me pause, and I remarked that it would be an omen of bad things to come. Little did I know at the time how correct that statement would prove to be. When we reached the front of this 2-story house, we discovered that the only way inside was to crawl one by one through a busted side window. Once inside, the place was shrouded in pitch blackness and had the look of a home that hadn't been walked through in decades. There was what seemed like an inch of dust covering everything, and it was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. We explored the first story for a short time, then made our way up the stairs to have a look around the second floor. It's hard to describe the fear of being 5 miles out in the country, secluded from the world, trapped in such a house. It's as if every door you open could hold a secret you do not wish to find. We systematically explored every upstairs room until we settled on the one that we would play Ouija in. We lit our candle, placed the board in the center of the room, and positioned ourselves at the 4 corners of the board. The planchette began moving smoothly almost instantly. This is not the case with most games of Ouija. It usually starts to move very slowly and eventually picks up steam. This time was different. The board told us of a couple that lived in the house years ago. It told us the husband had been murdered by his wife. How, we don't know. When we learned that a murder had taken place in the house, we all became apprehensive of going further. 2 members of the group suggested that it was time to quit playing and leave. I, however, wanted to press on. This is where I made my mistake. Since the others wanted to leave, I figured it was time to quit beating around the bush and get straight to the point. I asked the board if we could speak to the spirit of the woman who murdered her husband. I said aloud, "Spirit of this man's wife, if you are here, go to yes." At this point, the planchette began to move swiftly to yes. 2 of the members visibly recoiled at this action and snapped their hands back from the planchette, as if hit by an electrical charge. Now only 2 hands remained on the board. As it made its way ever closer to yes, I removed my fingers from the pointer, leaving only 1 person still playing, and that's when it happened. With only 2 fingers remaining on the planchette and it still moving, the last person loudly said no, and that's when the pointer slid out from under his hand by itself and floated 6 inches or so into the air while spinning slowly, landing on yes. When this happened, it was as if time itself had stopped. It may sound trivial to say, oh, something moved by itself, but when you actually witness it, it's as if everything becomes frozen and reality itself shatters right in front of you. What happened next was the scariest moment of my life. The friend who had been left to play alone let out the most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard. He would have trouble replicating it if you were to have buried a hatchet in his head. It was at this point that I briefly left my body. I could see the four of us and the board from above. When I came back to my body after what must have been mere seconds, my friend was convulsing in the corner from shock. We thought he was having a seizure. At this time, everyone is in a mode of sheer panic. Our friend is in the corner shaking uncontrollably with one hand outstretched as if pointing to something, and he's speaking incoherently. The thought crossed my mind that he may have been possessed, but at that point my only wish was to get us out of that house and as quickly as possible. We basically tackled him and held him down until he got a hold of his senses. Suddenly our flashlight went dead and we were all left terrified in complete darkness. I suggested that we all hold hands so we didn't lose one another and make our way out. I said a prayer as we fumbled through the darkness, down the stairs, and performed the painfully slow process of wedging ourselves out of the window one by one. I'm just thankful I was not the last to go through, standing alone in that house, even for a moment. After what had just happened, could have even driven one to madness. So that's the story of the single most terrifying event that ever happened to me, and I imagine that ever will. In closing, I would caution others against using an Ouija board. They are nothing to play around with. I've always believed in ghosts, spirits, otherworldly beings, and so forth. Call me gullible, but I'm the kind of person that totally buys the shit horror movies pull with their based on true events bull. So given all this, I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to play with an Ouija board. Although, play is not the right word. I know that now more than ever. About a month ago, I was shopping with a friend. As we wandered through the store, we wound up in the toy section. My friend was the one who pointed out the board and she dared me to buy it. She said I was probably too chicken to ever use it. To prove her wrong, I bought it and we headed back to my place. We went about the rest of our day, goofing off and just being normal, stereotypical girls. When 9 o'clock rolled around, the memory of my purchase struck me, and seemingly telepathically, my friend suddenly remembered too. She giggled and pulled the board from my bag, and then eagerly ripped the plastic wrap from the box. She pulled out the box's contents and laid them out on my kitchen table. The board, a planchette, and one sheet of simple instructions. While continuing to laugh, she tossed the instructions behind her and invited me to sit. I was nervous, and although I tried hard not to let it show, I knew she could see right through me, so I sat. I had seen how the boards worked in the movies and was vaguely familiar with the rules. In my mind I chanted, "We need to say goodbye." I knew this was an important step and a common mistake made in horror movies, a mistake I was not prepared to make. My friend set the planchette on the board and placed her fingertips on top of it. She looked at me and I did the same. She moved the planchette around in a circle, slowly, gently, and asked, "Is there anyone here who would like to speak with us?" She stopped the planchette and we waited. Everything was still and there was no noise. I'm pretty sure I stopped breathing. It felt like the whole world froze in a moment, and then I felt the slightest movement. I gave my friend the death stare, thinking she was just trying to scare me. Then I saw her expression and I knew she was just as surprised as I was. As the planchette moved across the board, it slowly spelled out the name Lily. We paused for a minute, looking at each other in disbelief, secretly begging the other to admit their prank. But it was real. We talked to the spirit of what seemed to be a young girl for about half an hour. She told us that she was 12, her favorite color was purple, and she even spelled out my pet bunny's name at one point, Luna. I calmed down and became less nervous as I realized that we were talking to a friendly spirit, or so I thought. It was weird, but I think in that moment my friend and I were pretty much having fun as we felt perfectly safe. It truly felt like a game in the moment. I opened my mouth to ask her if she was okay, but she interrupted me before I could even speak. "Lily, how did you die?" she asked. Suddenly there was a loud crashing from the room behind us. Startled, we both jumped up and without thinking ran out of the room to see what the commotion was. When we walked in, everything seemed to be perfectly undisturbed in its proper place. I turned a translucent white. My stomach fell, and my whole body tensed when I realized what we had just done. Without saying goodbye, we had effectively left the portal open. Who knows if anything sinister or pure evil had just managed to slip through in the few seconds we were gone. I ran back to the table to find that the Ouija board and the planchette were carefully placed underneath where they had been sitting on the table. I rushed down to the floor and frantically moved the planchette over and over the word goodbye, but I already knew it was too late. My friend didn't know what to say or do. She just looked all around the room, terrified of what was about to happen next. In a fit of rage, I screamed at the top of my lungs and threw the planchette and board back in the box. I walked straight over to my front door and dumped the box in the trash. I never wanted to see it again. I scolded myself over and over for purchasing the board in the first place, and even began to blame my friend for making me do it. I realized now how dumb my actions were. She was in no way accountable for what had just happened, but as I accused her further, we broke out into a fight, and she very angrily left my house. And just like that, I was left alone. Obviously, very frustrated by that point, I stayed up until the wee hours of the morning, doing work and cleaning up around the house when I finally calmed down. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning and I was exhausted, so I went to sleep. I can honestly say that nothing out of the ordinary happened in my house for the next 72 hours. The whole situation with the Ouija board and the possibility of an evil spirit entering my home had completely left my mind. The only thing that really resonated from that night was the fight with my friend, which I was still very upset about. I had my boyfriend over a couple of times, focused on my work, and just lived life as I normally would. But on the 4th day, things started to get weird. It started with things moving around on their own. I would leave my laptop on in the kitchen table and I would find it later sitting on my bed. I hung my keys on the hook where I always did, but I found them on the kitchen counter. It was subtle things that I quickly shook off. I even joked to my boyfriend that I must have been getting old. But by the 4th night, something in my house just didn't feel right. It's hard to explain, although I remember it vividly. But the best way to describe it is cold. It's almost as if my house had lost that feeling of home. I was a little paranoid, and since I was such a chicken, I asked my boyfriend to spend the night, and my knight in shining armor agreed. At 2:37 a.m., we both sat up straight in bed. I didn't hear a noise. I didn't have a nightmare. It was as if my body was doing it on its own. I looked at my boyfriend, and he had an expression of confusion mixed with a little fear on his face. So since we were both startled, we decided to stay up and watch some TV to calm down. After about 20 minutes, I heard frantic scratching coming from my bunny's cage down the hall. I ran over and found that my bunny was in the corner of his cage, breathing heavily, noticeably frightened. Luna, my bunny, was noticeably a quiet sleeper and rarely ever made a sound when in his cage. And certainly no noise anything close to this. I decided to take him out and lock him in my room for the night. Something just didn't feel right about the house, and I didn't want him to be alone if he was anywhere near as scared as I was. When morning came, I woke up to go start brunch. I took Luna with me, and I let him run all over the house like I normally would do. He was his normal, playful, happy self, and I once again felt calm. When I walked back upstairs to wake my boyfriend up, I noticed 3 short but somewhat deep scratches on the wall above my door frame. I froze to stare at it, and a few seconds later my boyfriend joined me at my side. When he looked at it, he pulled me back down the stairs, but my mind stayed on those scratches. I had seen the horror movies, and I knew what was happening. From that point on, things continued to move, but to ridiculous places. My cell phone was in the oven, some papers from work were under a couch cushion, Luna's food bowl was under my bed. I would constantly hear things crashing and breaking, but they were so loud they made me think on more than one occasion that someone had busted a window and was breaking in. But when I ran to the source of the noise, everything was where it should be. I started hearing whispers when I walked around the house. Seemingly they would come from around the corner, and as I tried to listen, they got softer until they were gone. The most upsetting for me was Luna. He was no longer acting like himself. He seemed to always be tired, he never wanted to play, and he stopped chasing my feet as I walked. He stopped sitting on my lap while I watched TV. He would just sit in the same spot on the floor until I picked him up to put him away for the day. Eventually, he stopped wanting to come out at all. He would sit in the corner of his cage and grunt angrily until I left him alone. He stopped touching his food. Growing worried, I brought him to the vet. Despite not having a fever, many signs of illness, and being a little over 1 year old, her best guess is that he had a cold. She gave me medicine, suggested I give him about a week to rest, and only feed him his favorite things, just to encourage him to eat as much as possible. I am now crying as I write this. Luna didn't make it much longer and passed away the night I came home from the vet. I know for a fact that he wasn't sick. Something was making him feel bad. Something was slowly killing him. That something was growing stronger off his life force. After that, when it was reached the worst, I would see it. As I slept, a large, black, dark figure stood in the corner and watched me. Its frame shook slightly, but it never moved towards me. It didn't have a face or eyes, but it felt like it was studying me. I was never able to move or speak, but for 2 nights, I just laid there and watched it watch me. By the 3rd night, I was convinced I had gone crazy. But I knew I couldn't stay in that house another night, so I packed up random things and went to my boyfriend's house. And that brings us to where I am now. I haven't told him exactly what was happening, and he just assumes I'm sad about Luna. In fact, I haven't told anyone until now. I have been trying to contact my friend that was with me that night, but she hasn't answered her phone or even bothered to read my messages. I've asked around and no one has seen her in a few days, so needless to say, I'm worried about her. I'm also worried about my house and whatever thing is living inside of it. I don't want to end up like the people do in the movies. I want to live. I want my house back. I didn't know who to ask about this, and seeing as I don't want my friends and family to think that I've absolutely lost it, I thought I would post here for some help. If anything, I hope you people are able to learn from my mistake. Don't mess with Ouija boards. I was in 7th grade. It was a regular day at school, and my friend had decidedly brought an Ouija board to school. We traveled over to the hill that my school accompanies, and we set up the board and began. Being the young, naive kids we were, we had absolutely no idea of what we could have started. After some fooling around between the 2 of us, the board actually began to move. The spirit, or demon I should say in this case, after some communicating, introduced itself as Zozo. It was unnerving to say the least, but thought nothing of it, and continued on with the so-called game. After getting nowhere, we called it a game and packed up. Later, after discussing with our friend what had happened, she told us that we had contacted a demon. We weren't sure what to say next. "You said goodbye though, right?" she asked nervously. None of us said a word. Things started getting weird after that, as my friend and I both noticed at school and home that there were doors being opened that I knew wasn't us. My friend, who played the Ouija board with me, later ended up in a mental institution due to this supposed ghost or demon. She'd claimed to see doors open, objects thrown, and heard voices, but no one believed her. So if you see an Ouija board, don't pick it up. It may just ruin your life.